Hello, and thank you so much for joining us here in this online space. My name is Lauren Deering, and I work at the New York Public Library on civic engagement programming, and I'm here to welcome you to tonight's conversation. We just elected our new mayor, of course, and so tonight we're sharing this opportunity to hear from some of the city's leading thinkers and activists to discuss big issues that our newly minted mayor might face, and to imagine the city's comeback in the months and years ahead. With us is Eli Dvorkin, the Editorial and Policy Director of Center for an Urban Future, Jeffrey Fagan, the Director of Columbia University's Center for Crime, Community, and Law, Elizabeth Yeampierre, Co-Chair of the Climate Justice Alliance and Executive Director of UPROSE, and moderating the talk is Eljoy Williams, President of the Brooklyn NAACP and the host of the excellent podcast, Sunday Civics. For more than a century, New York City's public libraries have supported and strengthened New Yorkers, our nation's democratic foundation, and our world by welcoming all and employing values of trust, inclusion, respect, and free and open access to information, knowledge, and opportunity. As trusted community centers, New York City's public libraries are one of the city's key partners in ensuring New Yorkers' voices are heard and counted. The New York Public Library is here for you. Learn more about the resources you need to be an informed voter and find events for the upcoming 2022 election with the library's voter information resources. Although the 2021 mayor election has been decided, you can register to vote in future elections with NYC Votes at any time. Today's conversation is part of the NYPL Voter Engagement Initiative and is offered in partnership between Brooklyn Public Library, the New York Public Library, and Queens Public Library. The New York Public Library's Voter Engagement Initiative is made possible by the Go Vote NYC Fund and the New York Community Trust, Chris Hughes and Sean Elridge, Antoinette Del Ruel and Joshua L. Steiner, and the Ratner Family Foundation. I'm going to turn this over to Eljoy momentarily. First, I want to let you know that if you have any questions for anyone on the panel, they'll be glad to take them at the end of the conversation. You can send your question at any time using the chat, Google form, or by emailing them at publicprograms@nypl.org. We'll make sure they see them, and they'll get to as many as they can. The library values your privacy, so we do want to let you know that even though the video and chat are on the nypl.org page, they're hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you might share data about yourself, which the library does not control. Lastly, real-time captions are available for tonight's program. You can click on the closed caption button or use the stream link shared in the reminder email and chat for a live transcript. So thank you so much for tuning in. Let's welcome on Eli Dvorkin, Jeffrey Fagan, Elizabeth Yeampierre, and Eljoy Williams.
All right. Good evening, everyone. And thanks so very much for joining us for this important conversation. I am Eljoy Williams, and I'm going to be your moderator for this evening's conversation. And I have some amazing folks to bring. As on my show, I say I bring to the front of the class because I love talking to nerds. And everybody I'm talking to this evening is nerds, including myself. And we have some great things to bring up, to have a conversation about, some important points that you can organize around as we go into this new administration, because the municipal general election is officially behind us. And in just less than 3 months, we will have a new mayor. But in addition, we'll have a brand new city council, as well as other citywide and local elected officials. And while there may be some shifting dynamics given COVID and other issues, some of the issues that both the mayor-elect, Eric Adams, the city council, and others will have to address are some of the issues that have not been addressed or been addressed by administrations in the past. So joining me for a conversation on some of the biggest issues, because New York City is a large city, but of small neighborhoods, and there are issues every block you go down. I have some great folks to bring to have this discussion. First is Eli Dvorkin, who is the editorial and policy director of the Center for an Urban Future. Then there is Jeffrey Fagan, who was mentioned before, professor of law at Columbia Law School and co-director of the Columbia Center for Injury Science and Prevention. And then Elizabeth Yeampierre, who's the co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance and executive director of UPROSE. Thanks, everybody, for being a part of this conversation. And I shared with them the first question that I was going to ask, just to give them a little bit of time to prepare their answer. And I'm actually going to start the other way around and start with you, Elizabeth. The question I have for all of you is, in this administration, Mayor-elect Eric Adams, what is one issue that if the administration addressed, you would stand at the press conference with the mayor on this issue, and what would you be announcing?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Eljoy, Ashe, and good evening to everyone. Buenas noches. I think for us, for those of us who are part of the climate justice movement, we would want the mayor to prioritize climate justice policies to both protect the most vulnerable Black and Brown New Yorkers while making our city more adaptable and resilient. Basically, his campaign platform was largely silent on these issues, and we would hope that he would also make a commitment to meaningfully work with environmental justice communities and commit to a form of co-governance, which is, in true transparency and accountability, and it's what climate change is demanding.
Okay, so all right, I can visualize that. All of the climate justice organizations on the steps of City Hall announcing something. Jeffrey Fagan, what would you stand with the mayor on the steps of City Hall, and what would you be announcing?
Well, I think the biggest public safety issue facing the city is the way that the neighborhoods of the city and the people in those neighborhoods engage with the police, and the way that the police engage with those people. This has been a source of tension for almost 30 years now, going back to administration in the early 1990s. And there's been quite a bit of litigation, quite a bit of political criticism, and quite honestly, quite a bit of division between communities as to what they want and expect from the police. And there have been some damages and some injuries from that. And I would encourage the mayor, and I would say to the mayor, I think from this point forward, we're going to have a collaboration between community and police in defining how we police our neighborhoods and how we ensure public safety. We talk about it as a co-production process, and I would encourage the mayor and hopefully advise him on how to create this co-production of security based on mutual respect and cooperation between citizens and the police.
Okay, climate justice, public safety. We are going to talk about a lot of that because it's big ticket items for the next administration. Eli, what are you standing on the steps of City Hall, and what are you announcing with the mayor?
Thank you so much, Eljoy. It's great to be here with everyone. I would stand up there for an announcement, which I think would address maybe the biggest challenge I think New York City faces, which is that far too few of the good jobs that the city has created historically and will create on its way out of this pandemic have gone to lower income New Yorkers and New Yorkers from communities of color. And I think the announcement would have to be the single largest investment in workforce development, job training, and college success that New York City's ever seen. And if the mayor put forward a proposal like that, I would be right there with them and cheering along.
So I actually want to start there because, part of the billing for this conversation was about the city's recovery. And quite frankly, not only will the city be in recovery for some time, the country and the world is in recovery, given the impact, the swift impact that COVID had, not only on our economy, but on our healthcare infrastructure. And if you look at the city of New York, our healthcare infrastructure is one that was weakened and, Elizabeth, sort of not equitable to begin with. And so to be hit by a pandemic of this size that we saw in our height of the infection and the sweep through the city really affected communities of color the hardest. That's where we experience a number of the deaths, the hospitalizations, and other things. And when we talk about a COVID recovery, it's the health infrastructure, it's the economic infrastructure, and the education infrastructure that we have to address, among other things. So Eli, I want to paint the picture first from the economic standpoint. Where was the city economically before the pandemic?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, listen, before the pandemic, we were at an all-time high for private sector jobs. The unemployment rate was near an all-time low. The economy had been doing well and adding record numbers of jobs for the past, 15, 20 years, coming out of, with dips from 9/11 and from the Great Recession, but nothing compared to what we've just experienced over the past 19 months. So since that time, we obviously saw unemployment spike. It hit a high of over 20% last May, which is a level we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Things have improved, obviously, but we just ended September with 3.6 million private sector jobs in New York City. That is the lowest level since 2014. The unemployment rate has declined from 20% in May, but it's still hovering around 9%, and it's significantly higher in many of our city's lowest income communities. That 9% citywide looks more like 20% in Brownsville or in Hunts Point. And it's more than double the rate before COVID hit. So right now, we're still at this point, after several months of a slow but somewhat encouraging economic recovery, we still have nearly 500,000 fewer people employed in New York City right now than we did in February of 2020.
Elizabeth, to my point earlier about our healthcare infrastructure, what was our healthcare infrastructure, to my knowledge, it still exists in its weakened state, but can you talk a bit about our healthcare infrastructure overall as a city, and maybe the inequity that existed there that, made us more vulnerable as a city and as a people?
Well, first, I think I want to say that when COVID landed, we knew that it was the communities that were living closest to the environmental burdens, people who historically have had to live near highways, waste transfer stations, incinerators, power plants, where there has been a legacy of pollution and extraction that had the highest levels of asthma, upper respiratory disease, diabetes, high blood pressure. We knew that COVID was going to land on those communities, that those were the communities that have not only been living in the midst of the discriminatory citing of environmental burdens in our communities, but also the communities that had the least access to good healthcare and consistent healthcare, the communities that have had to deal with a lot of the isms, and that shows up in terms of mental health, whether it's extreme policing, whether it's unemployment, whether it's poor educational opportunities. All those things create a health profile that exists in communities of color throughout the city of New York and throughout the country. And those are the same communities that were disparately impacted by COVID. And so when you've got this legacy of neglect and austerity, and then you've got a disease like COVID, what you're going to have is what happened to our communities. I lost several members of my family because of COVID. And what we all had in common was that we all grew up in environmental justice communities. So the system was not set up to serve a community that it historically has neglected. And then the impact of something that no one was prepared for exacerbated what were already underlying conditions that had been existing in our communities for a long time. And so I think that it's important that we contextualize it and that we talk about the legacy, because I think people act like, well, everything was okay and then COVID happened. Nothing was okay before COVID, and COVID only put a spotlight on the inequities and the racial injustice in New York City.
Jeffrey, to Elizabeth's point, in that, everything wasn't, a Disney movie before COVID, we can say the same thing about public safety in this city. And quite frankly, even through the pandemic, we saw communities come out and voice their frustration about the manner in which public safety is handled in this city. Can you talk a bit about where we were there?
Well, I think I want to just briefly go back to the conversation about health. we in our center, and I think across the public health community, we think of violence and injury as public health problems. And certainly those were exacerbated by the epidemic, the spike, the timing of the spike in gunshot injuries and murders, and murders using firearms, was timed almost perfectly to the onset of the pandemic. So I think we need to think about one of the strains on the healthcare system was brought about by the epidemic of gun violence. The epidemic of gun violence was coterminous or simultaneous with the epidemic of disease. And we don't plan in those ways for thinking about the health response to the violence epidemics and how those two go hand in hand. But the public safety challenges are really quite acute. Obviously, New York has experienced, like every other city in the country, a spike in gun violence, more than any other kind of violence. One of the things that's unique about this pandemic is that the violence epidemics are very specific to gun injuries and firearm injuries. We see it's important not to see this as a crime, necessarily just a crime problem, but a gun violence problem, not just a violence problem. The good news is we still remain well below the rates of violence that existed in the late 1990s, and we're still in the midst of a long-term 25-year decline. And so I think our policing and public safety strategies have to acknowledge that there's some continuity of safety. And one of the reasons for that decline has been public criminologists debate the reasons for the declines. But the one that I think makes the most sense for New York City is that the strength of the NGOs in the neighborhoods around the city, and the neighborhoods where the gun violence problems were the most acute, those NGOs helped to bring about a return to safety. And they've been put under stress by the pandemic as well, both economically and in terms of having people available because of the pandemic to do the kind of community organizing work. So one of the things that I think we can do in the pandemic or following the pandemic is to understand what the NGOs do to ensure public safety. It's not just the job of the police. Certainly they're important, but the NGOs are also very important, maybe as important. And I think the new mayor ought to recognize and needs to recognize the strength of those organizations and what they bring to the table in terms of ensuring the safety of New Yorkers.
Jeffrey, I'm going to come back to you on this next question because, I don't know how many of you have ever been involved in a political campaign, certainly one as running for mayor of New York City. But during the elections that's happening, particularly in the beginning, you get all of these questionnaires and all of these forums happen on issues such as large, vast number of issues to very small issues such as trash pickup in a particular census block or a particular community district. What I want to go to you on is continuing on that, not only what both Elizabeth and Eli have already mentioned and yourself, but what do we know about what Mayor-elect Eric Adams has said during his campaign on how he would address these issues?
Well, he's made a commitment to returning to some degree to a more aggressive style of policing that we've seen in the past. I guess it's been 8 years now. There's been a steady decline in aggressiveness of policing since the stop and frisk trial in 2013 and the court order that followed that. And it's been engagement of police with citizens has been on the decline. Some people feel that that's one of the reasons why the crime rates went up, why the violence rates went up. But if that were the case, then the decline of stop and frisk in New York was responsible for the rise of crime rates in every other city in the country. That logic just doesn't work out. But the costs of those policies were terrible. They were divisive. They pitted communities against one another. They pitted races against one another. They cost the city a fortune in litigation settlements. They put the city under a court order. Right now, the police department in the city is still under the supervision of the federal district court. And I don't think those are healthy things. I think because repairing that chasm of trust between the citizens and the police requires a style of policing that's going to engage with citizens, as we talked about earlier, that respect constitutional rights, that respect citizens, but that also prove to be more effective. One of the things that we learned, we're worried about guns now on the streets. One of the things we learned is that policing regime didn't do much good in terms of recovering guns. So we probably want to think about the way that we structure policing to ensure that those guns do get off the street. And we do it in a way that is very careful, very respectful, very strategically on point.
Elizabeth, I'm going to come to you in terms of what have you heard? Were you encouraged by, alarmed by what the Mayor-elect Adams has said about not only public safety, education, but climate justice, which is also in your wheelhouse? Oh, she's muted.
Sorry. Climate justice is really the intersection of racial justice and climate change. And so all of these things are of concern to us because they're all going to be exacerbated by climate change. But when we think about public safety, we think NGOs that are working to prevent displacement are working on public safety. NGOs that are creating economic instability are creating public safety. That literally we define violence as something beyond gun violence. And we think that the mayor in talking about extreme policing is concerning to us because we have seen how Black and Latino youth in particular have been targeted. And we are concerned about our children. We're always concerned when any of our boys walk outside, not because they're going to be shot by somebody in the neighborhood, but because a police officer may be having a bad day. So that's concerning to us. And we know that recurrent extreme weather events are also going to bring martial law and extreme policing. And this has been a mayor that has literally shut down protests. He's the mayor now, but when he was when he was the Brooklyn Borough president, one of the things that was concerning to us was that we had an action when we were fighting a developer in Sunset Park, and his response to the action was to shut down the hearing and to call the police on us. That's before he becomes mayor. So I think social justice activists all over the city are bracing themselves for what's going to be a mayor who is going to take us back in time with all of the understanding that we have about how you share power, how communities that are strong and that have jobs and that are well cared for, where there's less violence. I think that his way of thinking about policing is really conventional and dated. It is going to create tremendous tensions in the city of New York, and it is really concerning for us. Especially, we just had Hurricane Ida. People's basements were flooded. We learned a lot about Superstorm Sandy, and we know that all of this climate disruption is going to really impact those people who are the poor people in our community, the people without the economic means. And so we're hoping for someone who is more progressive and is thinking about policing in a way that honors the people in the community and provides a different kind of training to the police force, because it is really concerning what can happen under his leadership.
Eli, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the intersection between policing and education and policing the economic futures of young people in the city. One of the things we learned during the stop and frisk era, the era that the mayor is promising to return to, is that style of policing caused sharp declines among Black and brown youth, particularly young males, in their school test scores. We did another analysis of the data on this, and we found that that aggressive model of policing created a very high spike in the dropout rate, school dropout rate. And so again, particularly among Black and brown youth in the city. And so the style of policing is almost a conscious acceptance of the risk of mortgaging the future of young people, their marketability in the workplace, which affects their economic futures, and which affects the economic futures of the neighborhoods that they come from. Because the more that people are working and contributing, the more that economic life is normalized, the safer the communities become. And so
just to that point, that connection, because the mayor-elect made education a central part. He has very passionate stories about both himself and that connection he makes of being dyslexic, and though a large percentage of people who are on Rikers having educational difficulties, and being able to intervene in the education that will have an impact on reducing the issues we're having in terms of public safety.
Right. Well, I think it's prioritizing control over human development. and that's the model of the policing regime. And being willing to entertain sharp costs that are borne by the poorest communities that are the most heavily policed, without necessarily a showing of a payoff in increasing public safety. Well, remember, one of the things that we learned about the policing regime during that time was that if we're worried about guns and gun violence, and I think that is what comes to mind for most New Yorkers when we hear about crime, the police don't do a great job at getting guns off the street. So to pursue policies that have this adverse effect on educational outcomes, and to prioritize that, and to fund the police at a level that's going to continue that, if not expand it, this doesn't spell for a healthy economic and social development in the poorest communities in the city.
Eli, I want to come to you because one of the refrains during the primary season, when the mayor-elect was up against, it seemed like everybody and their mama was running for mayor during the primary season. And one of the, I remember one of the quotes was like, getting people a job, right? Getting people access to employment is one of the fastest ways to address issues as it pertains to public safety or housing. And you mentioned in the upfront that workforce development and investing in ensuring that people at working class, poverty level, or below the poverty line actually also are participating in an economic recovery is extremely important. What should be on the mayor-elect's radar in terms of what the administration needs to do in order to make that happen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I think, the first step is looking at where we've lost all of these jobs over the past 19 months. And the reality is those are jobs that are disproportionately held by immigrants, by Black and Brown New Yorkers, by young people. And so we've seen the disproportionate impact of the economic crisis on those New Yorkers. So looking at where those jobs have been lost, it's a totally unequal picture across industries and across geographies. Right now, since February 2020, jobs in accommodations are still down almost 60%, in food service down 30%, in transportation 22%, personal care, which includes nail salons and barbershops, as well as laundromats, down 20%, retail still down 13%. And these are industries that have provided a large number of accessible jobs historically. There's challenges with those jobs, not least of which is that many of them don't really pay a living wage in New York City in 2021 or 2022, but they are jobs. They're jobs that we had until COVID hit. And so starting to look at policies that can help to revive those specific sectors is part of what the next mayor is going to have to do. But I think there's an even bigger challenge, which is that those may be jobs that are important in the short term, but over the long term, we see a different path where we look at where jobs have actually grown in New York City. And the reality is that the industries that have been the defining industries for middle-class jobs in New York City in decades and generations past have been hit hard, not just by COVID, but by forces that extend way beyond COVID: globalization, offshoring, and deindustrialization. Manufacturing, which was probably the gold standard for good, accessible jobs for most of the 20th century, is down 31% over the past decade. It's actually the biggest loss of any industry other than accommodations. And accommodations was far more impacted by the pandemic. At the same time, we can look at where jobs have increased over the past decade or so. We're seeing jobs up 16% in advertising and other creative industries, up 37% in tech. Probably the single largest source of new middle-class jobs in New York City, but not nearly as accessible as the middle-class jobs of decades past. Jobs are also up 26% in professional services. That's, broadly speaking, a lot of office jobs, which obviously withstood the pandemic much better, and folks are still working at home while frontline workers were either exposed to the health risks and impact of COVID-19 or lost their jobs entirely. So we've got some huge structural inequalities in our economy that this mayor is inheriting. To me, I think the focus has got to be not only on reviving those parts of the economy that are still hurting. That's part of it. And I think that's specifically tourism, which drives so much of the job growth, or the jobs that we've lost are so deeply connected to the growth of tourism over the past 20 years. And the number of visitors to New York had doubled to 65, 66 million people annually right before COVID hit. And now we're at a fraction of that. And the other part of that immediate impact is the return to the office. So many of those industries that were seeing those incredible job losses, in food service and arts and entertainment, transportation and personal care are really closely connected to the fact that New Yorkers who do have office jobs in general aren't back in the offices yet. A 20% decline in office occupancy is directly correlated with a 40+% decline in tax levies on commercial real estate. So we're dealing with some huge structural challenges based on how COVID is reshaping our economy. The third thing I'll mention is that in addition to getting those parts of our economy back again, we need to focus on where these good jobs have been growing. And the reality is that those jobs do not reflect the diversity of New York City today. They didn't before COVID, and they don't right now. So just by way of example, today or just prior to the pandemic, Black New Yorkers were accounted for about 7% of the workforce in advertising. That's one of those sectors that's grown significantly in the past 10 years, where most of the jobs are good middle-class jobs or pay even better than that. But it doesn't even come close to reflecting the fact that, Black New Yorkers are almost a quarter of all New Yorkers. So we see similar alarming disparities in publishing, in tech, obviously, and even in some industries that are generally a little more accessible. Black New Yorkers still only make up about 16% of the construction workforce in New York. So, my point there is really that we see where these good jobs have grown. The challenge is that those jobs have not gone to, those jobs aren't going to New Yorkers that reflect the full diversity of our city. They're not going to enough Black and Hispanic New Yorkers. They're not going to enough New Yorkers who've grown up in low-income communities. The challenge then for the mayor becomes, how do you build much stronger pathways into those jobs? And there's no one answer. It involves investments in job training and workforce development. It involves investments in career training and education in our K-12 system. I think it especially involves doing a lot more to help boost college success, boosting success in our community colleges in particular, where still today, only about 27% of CUNY community college students will graduate with a degree in 3 years. That is unacceptably low if we're going to make real progress in expanding access to these good jobs, which have been growing and will grow out of the pandemic, but which increasingly require a post-secondary credential of some kind, which, as we know, is not where we see huge inequalities in terms of who has those credentials in New York City today.
Yeah. So
to me, that's going to be the mayor's probably greatest challenge if he's really intentional about building a more equitable economy in the future.
Well, lastly, Eli, on that point, just to quickly wrap that up before I move, is are government jobs still good jobs? Just connecting the two, right? We do have, for a certain generation of New York City, particularly Black and brown folks, having a job with the city, with the state, with the agency allowed them entry, or at least allowed them to stabilize in the middle class in the city. They were able to, buy homes and invest and sort of put roots in the city. And then I don't know that we have like the full data on it in terms of with the vaccine mandate, sort of how that allows more opportunity for, to sort of recruit more people into that space. But in general, people still view government jobs as a good job. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, certainly in general, government jobs in New York City are absolutely good jobs. Most of them are, vast majority are unionized, and you've got good benefits, decent pay, and job security obviously counts for a lot. I think potentially the challenge there is that, and I won't get too far into this, but the next mayor is going to inherit a pretty significant budget deficit. The city's workforce was at an all-time high going into the pandemic. The workforce had grown by a significant number, tens of thousands during the 2 terms of Mayor de Blasio. So I think, those jobs will continue to be good jobs. The question is, can that make up at all for the fact that we've seen such a shortfall in good jobs in the private sector, especially accessible jobs, given that the next mayor may actually be forced to consider trimming the city's workforce rather than growing?
Yeah. Elizabeth, I want to come back to you on this intersection question of infrastructure, climate, and housing, because another issue that has been, I've been in city politics here in New York for, I'd say now 25 years, and housing and homelessness, right, has been something that we have discussed, since that time, and it has only grown exponentially. And it seems that, you know, everybody always had the next administration, the next mayor, the next city council, right, always has these plans about building more housing, and it's supposed to be for people, but it ends up being for luxury and lots of giveaways to other folks. Am I missing something?
No, I think if I can, I'd like to connect Eli's response to the question that you just asked. So I want to do that because we didn't talk about green jobs. We didn't talk about, we have in New York City 5 significant maritime industrial areas, and many of which they're trying to convert into spaces for recreation, destination locations for the privileged in New York, and turn our communities into sort of a servant economy for that body of people, and tech, and provide space for tech. These are opportunities, these are places that have bled manufacturing jobs, but can really be repurposed to build for climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, where we will have jobs in solar installers, wind technicians for offshore wind, engineers, sustainable manufacturing. Instead of following the market, we can be creating a market that is going to serve New York City, which is an island, and is going to be suffering from storm surge and extreme heat. Green infrastructure installation, designers, electricians, construction, recycling, electric vehicle technicians. You know, the subway was inundated with water, and it might not be something we'll be able to use anymore because it's not nimble and accessible in the face of climate change. It wasn't built for that. Permeable surfaces, what kind of materials are we using so that we can make our communities carbon neutral? Those are all jobs. And we haven't done an assessment to find out what are the skills that are needed to fill that market, and that market must be here in New York City. Those are good paying jobs that are union jobs, and that is the market that this mayor needs to embrace. Now, with that market, if people are able to access green jobs so that they can start building a city that is dedicated to adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, people will be able to afford to live in these communities. The truth is that even our environmental amenities are successes. When we've been able to double the amount of open space and green up the neighborhood, it becomes the thing that developers use to displace our communities. I don't know a lot about housing. I know that, and so I don't feel like I have the qualifications to talk about that, but I do know that in working class communities where you have an industrial sector that's alive and that has jobs that pay well, that it maintains the working class character of the community, and people are able to continue to live there. Small businesses, which are, you know, the backbone of Black and brown communities, are able to thrive. And so to talk about the future of New York City without talking about green jobs, and without talking about the fact that that we are susceptible to extreme weather events like we've seen, and that we haven't invested in infrastructure to be able to keep us out of harm's way, is not to talk about the future of New York City. So right now, you know that at the federal level, Biden is pushing Justice 40 that comes out of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was literally passed in the state of New York, the most aggressive piece of legislation that provides access to resources for investments in infrastructure. And I think that those are the jobs that we need to be looking at. And those things, as everyone's mentioned here, are all connected. It's impossible to talk about these issues without talking about how multidimensional they are and how they're all connected to each other.
Oh, Joy, can I make a connection between the housing question and public safety?
Yeah, I was actually going to come to you for that. So, sure, go ahead.
Good. There are experiments in cities around the country. I guess the one that's gotten the most publicity is in Philadelphia, where instead of saturating the poorest neighborhoods with the worst housing with patrol and aggressive enforcement and aggressive engagement of citizens, with police, with citizens, they've diverted the money into rehabbing the neighborhoods. And there's lots of pictures. There's a book out by one of my colleagues who participated in that study. And the evidence is really quite powerful. They did it with an experimental design. They took some neighborhoods and rehabbed them, and other neighborhoods they left alone. And these were both matched neighborhoods, high crime places. And after the rehabbing, the neighborhoods, the violence rates in the neighborhoods went way down, People's housing was there. Their housing improved. They didn't leave. It didn't turn into a gentrification issue. It turned into a neighborhood development issue that benefited the people in the neighborhood. And actually, the police could claim that they were doing a good job. Good for them. But they didn't have to, because it was the housing improvement that gave people stakes in the community. And those stakes are really important. And they translate in part into being better prepared for the workplace, because they can just have the resources to go out and do work and not worry about the secondary issues that work strains produce, family care and so on. So I think there's a very important intersection of these two policy issues. And if we're going to put all the housing money into luxury developments, that's not going to benefit the poorest communities that are the most heavily policed. And so there's a logic to how we do these investment strategies.
Well, I mean, in general, for the three of you, there's not only the mayor, and, we like to think of the New York City mayor as all powerful, certainly is a very powerful executive position here in the city of New York, and having control of the agencies and setting the direction does give the mayor an immense amount of power to be able to implement policies on their own. But there's still a city council to contend with, as well as, other elected officials, be it the comptroller, that also helps in controlling the purse strings here. Given who has been elected and what they've campaigned on, whether it's the brand new council, a new comptroller, sort of all the new borough presidents and others, give any of you hope in terms of how the city should be directed in this recovery period?
My understanding is that, just very briefly, my understanding, so I regularly get emails from Brad Lander. And so I think everyone in New York has and he's pursuing a very aggressive social democracy agenda, which includes strong oversight of the police, which is something that's actually been lacking for the past, going back to the Giuliani administration. Effective oversight of what the police do, and through the city council and through the other elected officials in the city. I think that's an interesting tension that's going to come up. I know that there were attempts to track the amount of money, the payouts on litigation, which were enormous. Roughly $1 billion over the 12 years of Bloomberg went to settle police misconduct cases. Think about what we could do with that $1 billion. So I think there's going to be some interesting tensions politically between the mayor, who is going to be a little bit less all powerful in the face of resistance from the city council, and particularly from the other elected officials.
So I'm excited about the city council. I am. I think that I feel that there is an overwhelming consistency in their message about centering racial justice and equity. I've had an opportunity to meet with so many of them, and they've been talking about how do you keep the rents down? How do you make building upgrades accessible? And we're talking about the kind of green upgrades that I would be talking about, right? How do we engage in comprehensive community-based planning and implementation to address those concerns about energy bills and increases from electrification? So I think that they're really sort of out of the box thinker. Think about who our representatives have been historically. Historically, our representatives have focused on things like education, criminal justice, employment, aging, right? Youth services. Those have been the buckets. We are talking about agriculture, food sovereignty. We're talking about infrastructure. We are having a different conversation. People of color now and leadership are talking about having a very different conversation. And also, what does a community process of engagement look like where there's a system of co-governance? And the reason co-governance is important is that elected officials can no longer speak for us and expect us to, and work to manage our expectations. Because climate change is disruptive, it's going to disrupt everything, including governance. And so this idea of sharing governance, of having communities more meaningfully engaged, not just in community-based planning, but in research and in operationalizing what we call a just transition, a move away from an extractive economy to a regenerative one, that's the kind of stuff that we're listening to them all talk about. And so I feel like it's really exciting, because in dealing with those things like infrastructure and energy and food and water, right, we're also talking about health. We're talking about policing, and we're talking about what does it take for a community to thrive in the face of recurrent extreme weather events, and they're coming. So I'm excited that there is also humility where they are comfortable with shared leadership and working with people on the ground in a way that historically has not been the case, where we've seen as outside trying to get at the table, right? I think that this is a big table. So maybe I'm being Pollyannish about it, but I'm excited about the city council.
Okay.
Can I raise another intersection question here, but on both the issues that Elizabeth is talking about and public safety issues? And Eljoy raised this early on. Rikers, there's a strong move to close Rikers and spread across the city the jail function, the incarceration function, and that's a very expensive proposition. It's going to require land acquisition. Historically, that has not benefited poor people. Those places go into their neighborhoods. It devalues the land. And all it does is perpetuate the same rates of incarceration that we know now are very destructive both to neighborhoods and to individuals, particularly people of color. It needn't be that way. Rikers is a nightmare. We all understand the terrible social and health and personal costs of Rikers. But alternatives do exist in the form of smaller, very decentralized, smaller units for the people who do need some kind of pretrial security. And there are people like that. We shouldn't be naive about it. But the investment strategy, the impact backwash onto housing and neighborhood development, and the choices that are made, economic development versus building a jail. Maybe the construction unions will benefit from this. That's quite possible, but those are a very special part of the workforce. That's not the workforce that benefits the communities of color. So I think there's a point now where people can come together from different interest groups, economic development, housing, education, also just simply that, and public safety, to talk about a strategy for rearranging that function that Rikers serves. This is a point where I think the public can be educated while we achieve some strong good by stopping that movement to build more jails, basically.
Eli, I see you motioning. Are you trying to get in on this conversation too?
No, I was really just listening in, but I do share some of that optimism, though. Frankly, I'm an optimist by nature, so maybe that's just who I am. But both in the council and frankly, I'm very willing to be an optimist about the next mayor at the moment as well. I think in part because I was just going back to the housing conversation. The mayor-elect is someone who said pretty clearly, we need to be building more housing adjacent to transit and wealthy neighborhoods. That's, I think, the right idea. I just wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that, that we don't also just need to be developing housing. We have added population at a rate that has far outpaced the rate at which we've added new housing in New York City. And while I by no means think that just adding supply is going to solve our problems, and I really agree with something Elizabeth said, that part of the way that you combat displacement is by expanding economic opportunities in communities that are experiencing those pressures, so folks can actually afford to stay in their community and contribute and build their communities, collectively. But at least one part of the solution is that we haven't added housing in New York City at a rate that can help to contribute to keeping rising housing costs under control. And I think it's actually really admirable that the mayor-elect has said, let's build more housing in communities that have resisted it really effectively in recent years, and that's some of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. So it's just one thing that I'm looking closely at, but I'm willing to be optimistic about for the moment. The other thing I would just say quickly about the incoming council, and I agree, there's lots of reason for optimism, but I'm someone who's really looked very closely at the unsexy issues around expanding economic mobility. And to me, the thing that I'm most optimistic about is that there's almost universal agreement that we need to focus on policies that will rebuild an economy that's far more equitable than what we inherited, than what incoming elected officials are inheriting. I couldn't agree more with that. I think where it gets tricky is that I hear a lot less specific ideas and a lot less focus on specific policies that can actually help to achieve that. And I think some of what Elizabeth's talking about in major new investments in community-led climate investments to combat climate change is obviously a huge part of that. I think a big part of it is investments in the very kind of the grunt work of building workforce development and job training infrastructure at the community level, which is not sexy, which doesn't get headlines, which is really difficult to do, but is incredibly important. And there are communities across the city where folks that don't necessarily have the social capital, the education, or the training to connect with those good jobs that are going to be leading our city out of this economic downturn. Those communities need investments in local infrastructure, local hiring and employment and training networks that know the community, that have the trust of the community, that also are connected with employers and educational institutions that can start to actually build stronger pathways into those jobs. But we don't necessarily see the same focus from elected officials on specifically doing that, even though there's, I think, almost universal agreement diagnosing the problems that we have. And one other area where I think it's really needed, that focus is needed, is on boosting college and career success in our public colleges. You know, I'm a huge believer in the power of CUNY. I think it's the most powerful mechanism for economic mobility that we have as a city. But CUNY is underfunded. Specifically, investments in college success and helping low-income students succeed in college, stay in school, and complete are lacking. And I would say, in particular, around understanding the problems that those non-tuition financial barriers pose for CUNY students. You know, the reality is that CUNY's tuition is relatively affordable, not only because it's lower than most private universities, and not only because we have the state tuition assistance program, there's also federal Pell Grants. The reality is that for most CUNY students, they do get support with tuition. A large number of students get their tuition covered completely, but that still isn't enough to boost graduation rates on its own. And that's because of the cost of books and technology, childcare, and
even a Metro card.
A Metro card, absolutely. And one of our recommendations from our recent work around boosting community college success is for the next mayor to put together a platform to build, to give every community college student in New York City a free Metro card. I think that would directly boost college graduation rates and would be a huge step toward expanding economic mobility. But these are the nitty-gritty details that I think get overlooked sometimes in the big picture agreement that we have in unequal economy, that we need to foreground equity. But what I'm really looking forward to, and what I'm expecting and hoping to see from this next city council, are specific concrete policies that actually one by one help to build better pathways into the good jobs of the future.
Perhaps the new mayor can have a better relationship with the new governor. So that funding.
Well, I was going to bring that in next.
I'm sorry, I got you, LJ.
Yeah, you guys are right with me.
We can talk about it together. But yeah, this affects the funding stream to CUNY and some of the structures of the ability of people to succeed educationally and move into those jobs that Eli's talking about.
So what's your question, LJ?
Well, here's the question, right? Because quite often people see New York City politics, unless it's the governor and the mayor bickering, right? Or they see it separate, right? There's what happens in New York City politics. There's what happened, with the governor and the legislature, and even further away, what happens in DC. But tying all of the conversation that we've had this evening together, right now is being negotiated large Build Back Better legislation. There were also bills passed during the height of COVID that saw billions of dollars come into the state. And that requires this cooperation with not only the federal government, but with the state, that the city must have to be able to, one, draw down some of that money, and then two, to be able to use it in a more effective way. And I think that was one of the questions that we had from the audience was, what will the impact be of a new governor, the medium term? So they're not the long term in another election cycle, but what will that relationship look like?
So right now we think it's a critical moment for climate justice in New York State. And you know that in 2019, UPROSE and New York Renews, which is a coalition, statewide coalition of over 300 members, led the push to pass the nation's most progressive and aggressive climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, something that is now being replicated all over the United States and the federal government used for Justice 40. Now, as the plan started by the CLCPA to completely transform our state is being finalized, and that's happening right now, we need to fully fund the CLCPA to ensure a just transition for New York State. That would mean jobs, that would mean food sovereignty, being able to take care of so many of the things that we talked about today. And to do that, the governor and the legislature need to fund climate justice in the 2022 New York State budget. And so those of us who are activists, to ramp up the pressure on them, we're having a huge march on November 13th. I have to mention that. It starts at noon in Times Square, and we'll go to Governor Hochul's office, where we will be doing a special action and a press conference, because now's the time to build momentum. And just so you know about the power of this legislation, just last week, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation denied 2 permits for new gas plants in New York on the basis of being inconsistent with the CLCPA. It's a climate justice victory. And people may think, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that tons of emissions, PM 2.5, NOx, SOx, all of that toxic fine particulate matter isn't going to land on the air passages of our elders and our children, and isn't going to compromise their health. So all of this that we're talking about is funding that will provide more jobs, provide more health benefits for our communities, because they will be healthier, because we will reduce emissions, and will take us out of harm's way, or will get us there, will get us on the path to taking out of harm's way for climate change. It also creates a vine, and I don't say pipeline, I say vine, because pipelines are bad and vines are good. A vine for educational opportunities for our young people in a lot of different kinds of things that they can be doing to address the changing climate. So I would invite people to join us November 13th. And I think that I hope that the link to RSVP is added.
Yeah, Jeffrey, because you brought up the point about this this greater cooperation, are you encouraged by that that the state seems to now have with the mayor-elect?
Well, there seems to be some respect. I think part of that comes from the fact that he did time in Albany. And did time is not the right word. He was in the legislature in Albany and understands the culture of the legislature. And he was effective, I think, as a state senator. So I think there is a grace period, a bit of a honeymoon, and it'll be interesting to see who he aligns with in Albany, whether he can keep the Democratic coalition that seemed to be doing well and doing even better after the mayor had to the governor had to step back. We'll see if he can keep those bridges strong and traffic flowing both ways on those bridges. But I'm sort of encouraged by that. I think there is some political capital that he brings to that two-way street between Albany and the city. That's going to be very helpful. Now, whether that translates into specific acts is something very different. I know there's been a scapegoating of the bail reform movement. Bail reform is really critical. It basically keeps people from going to jail. And if they don't go to jail, their outcomes in court are much better. We know this is an empirical fact. Whether or not he can, which side he'll take in the bail reform question, which was really part of the dynamic of the election, particularly, partly in New York, but really actually the outside New York in the suburbs, which affects the composition of the legislature. So I'm hoping that he will see the light on this and not take the political expedient of beating up on bail reform. But that's just one issue that I think he can turn to. And if we go back to the CUNY question, that's another. If we go back to the funding of education, both public education for K through 12 and also CUNY, that's another. These are opportunities for him to build bridges with his former colleagues in Albany that will benefit the city.
Mm. Well, on that, we have just a few minutes left, so I want to go around, and Eli, I'll come back to you. We started off the conversation asking, what would you stand with the mayor on? Now I'm going to ask you, what is your advice to the mayor and to the city council that's coming in? I know advice may not be the same, but I'll start with you, Eli.
Well, thanks so much, Joyce. It's been great to be with all of you today. I'd say I think my first piece of advice would be that that rebuilding a more equitable economy has to be the first mission for elected officials, and that's going to not mean just one thing. It's going to mean a set of intersecting policies that together can help to expand economic mobility. It's the things that I mentioned around real meaningful investments in workforce development, I think, coupled with dedicated funding, which is something the state could help with. It means, dramatically boosting graduation rates in our colleges, especially our community colleges, and linking that to post-college success in the jobs that are growing and that are going to power the city's economic recovery. And I think it means a much deeper commitment to ensuring that economic development and workforce development are tied together. They're not seen as two totally separate functions of government, but actually as inseparable, including, I think, directing some portion of economic development dollars into workforce development so that folks are actually gaining the skills and experiences that they need to get good jobs that economic development can help to spur and create. So, that's going to be tough. That's a lot of work in the midst of still simply trying to tend to an economic recovery in the first place. But I think that focus on a more equitable future has to be the first priority.
Jeffrey?
I would tell him that we know a lot about what works, and we know a lot in public safety, and we know a lot about what doesn't work in public safety, and what has negative returns to political engagement and so on. So I would suggest to him that he have a council of people who would develop knowledge, perhaps a policing kind of a civilian commission on public safety that generates ideas and develops models for testing. I think perhaps a little bit along the lines of what the Vera Institute does. And that the experiments take place where we try and see what benefits neighborhoods and what benefits particularly the people who are the most heavily policed in the city. But learn the lessons from the research that's been done about what works and what doesn't work, and avoid what doesn't work and do more of what does work.
All right, Elizabeth?
I would say that since we're facing the biggest threat to our existence in human history, that he has to incorporate a climate lens into every single agency, that he has to make sure that there's better interagency collaboration and coordination, that community-based planning has to be supported and frontline solutions have to be invested in, that no longer can we tolerate top-down decision-making because otherwise we won't survive. And that we need to make sure that we have an economic development plan that makes it possible for us to invest in climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. And if we don't do any of those things, then we are not going to be able to thrive or survive in the face of what is heading our way. And I think that there's going to be a need for humility, not thinking that he has all the answers, but to think of as community leaders and the people on the ground who've been doing the work for a minute as the brain trust that he can be in partnership with, because I think collectively we can make a big difference. And then just one final thing I want to say. I love the fact that this is the New York Public Library because I spent my life as a child in the library and it was just like my safe haven. So that's the only thing I just wanted to say.
Oh, I love, libraries are I have this dream of going on, people have dreams of going on tour, and playing big stadiums. I have a dream of going on tour to libraries across the country, and I'm going to make it happen in my lifetime, including New York Public Libraries. I want to thank each and every one of you for a really good, expansive conversation. Hopefully, the mayor or somebody's on his team was listening to our advice and our direction from this time. If you need more information, want to check out a book maybe about New York City politics or about the race, I actually came up with a book list that the New York Public Library is sharing of books that are related to New York City politics that is equitable, that includes not only the storied lives of the wealthy, but includes small communities across this city, of ethnic enclaves, but also the political history that you need to know, that if you want to get involved in getting engaged in the city politically. So thank you so very much for each and every one of you for participating. Thank you to Eli, Elizabeth, and Jeffrey. And we will see you out probably at a library. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. For more information and to register for upcoming programs, visit nypl.org/live.